This story began one beautiful sunny day over lands full of greenery and mountains. A crack in the universe appeared in the sky above the field where the girl was grazing sheep. The girl raised her head to the sky at the terrible sound of cracking and froze in fear. The crack became a hole. The sky crumbled into fragments, and someone's huge scarlet eye looked at her. Thus the human world was captured by the demon king. But the divine knights serving God fought him back. By swearing an oath to God, these knights were granted supernatural powers and brought the demons back to their lands. However, demonic miasma remained in high concentrations in some areas. Most of those who were infected with these miasmas died, but there were survivors among the infected who not only changed, but became the same demon. Such demons, like ordinary ones, began to feed on people and accordingly, hunt people. All that remained of the people in them were individual features of a human face. So the knights continued their battle, hoping to one day clear their land. Kiran, the young deputy commander of the 9th Squad, killed the demon, but came back to the ashes. There was no one left alive in the village he had come to save. An assistant ran to the commander and reported the appearance of a red moon. The red moon is a sign that a powerful demon is appearing in the human world. The assistant pointed out where the moon was coming from and suggested returning to headquarters. Red moonlight was pouring from a nearby building. However, the commander decided not to leave, but to go to that building. To his great surprise, he found a baby there, alive and well. This is how our hero, who is now staying in a shelter, was found 15 years ago. Every time the children at the orphanage received their portion of food, they heard a sermon about gratitude to the knights. Now our hero Luca was receiving his portion of food, and was indignant that his portion was smaller than everyone else's. However, noticing how embarrassed the guy at the distribution point was, he smoothed over the conflict himself, and went to eat at the table. Unlike the other orphans, he sat at the table alone and ate silently, immersed in his thoughts. He didn't remember his past, but he knew how he was found by knights in a ruined village, and the fact that he was the only one to survive, and that he had a birthmark on his face, was perceived by those around him as a sign of a demon. That's why other kids at the shelter often bullied him by dumping slop into his plate. Of course, most often these bullies were the same guys, and they were also physically bigger than Luca. But Luke couldn't hate them, because everyone who was in this shelter lost their entire family because of the demons. Zadira called some kid to him. Luca immediately recognized the child who came just the day before yesterday. The bully sat down next to the baby and told those around him that the baby's parents had been eaten by a monster. And now the bully and the other orphans demanded that Luca apologize to the kid for all the monsters. Luca tried to explain that he was human, but the baby no longer listened to him and demanded that his mother be returned to him. From this sincere hatred in a still small child, Luca froze in place. Therefore, he did not have time to protect himself from the blow of the bully, who pinned him to the ground. And the bully continued to demand an apology from Luca, not allowing our hero to get up. Since Luca could not respond to his opponent and sincerely empathized with the baby, he apologized. After a couple of blows, he was released, and at the end of the day, he was given the job of washing the floors. This has been going on for 10 years now, and Luca has come to terms with it, especially since he can't leave the shelter until he comes of age. However, when the orphans turn 15 years old, a priest from the Order of Divine Knights comes to them. Not wanting to stay in the shelter any longer, Luca wanted to try himself in this selection in 5 days. After 5 days, all willing orphans were invited to take the oath and become a knight. As he wanted, Luca came to try his hand and waited his turn. To his discomfort, he stood next to the bully, who even at that moment managed to let out insults. The priest at the altar explained that the orphans had to take an oath, and if the water in the cup turned blue, they had not passed the selection. But if the cup shines with gold, the orphans will have to make an oath to God and offer God the most important thing. The orphans and Luke listened attentively, because the ceremony could only be performed once in a lifetime. The priest looked at the orphans with his attentive gaze and asked them to be careful what they wished for. Suddenly, words about an oath were heard over the entire crowd in the temple, and everyone immediately recognized whose voice it was. Zadira, without waiting his turn, immediately shouted out his oath that he would not run away from the monsters. It turns out that his younger sister was eaten before his eyes, and now he does not want to retreat from the enemy. The guy promised that despite the danger and the enemy's power, he would not retreat and would definitely kill all the monsters. After these words, the first bowl of holy water in the shelter began to shine golden. The priest announced that God had accepted the first oath and that now the boy would not be able to run away again. Zadira immediately grabbed the cup and drank its contents in one gulp. A golden shimmering cloud enveloped the boy, and he immediately felt strength within himself. This inspired the bully's friend, and he immediately rushed to take an oath to become a wanderer. When he was accepted, a stream rushed towards the cup. each one taking an oath without thinking about the consequences. Luke's turn came last, and the priest invited him to the cup. But standing in front of her, Luca became nervous and did not know what important thing he could swear by. Inspired, he began his speech that he simply wanted to become a knight and protect people. However, when the time came to offer something to the god, the hero fell silent and did not know what to say. Luca had nothing to offer. He just wanted to leave the shelter and be happy. Luca panicked from excitement, tried to say something, to find something important, but nothing came to mind. Luca didn't understand what was happening, but something inside him contracted and arched his body. Luca quickly came to his senses, not understanding what had happened, but noticed that his cup was full of some kind of blue liquid. Everyone who was in the shelter froze in surprise, because this was the first time. The priest saw such a cup with a frightening aura for the first time and ordered everyone to disperse. However, Luke refused to end the ceremony. He had not yet become a knight as he wanted, but suddenly someone attacked him with sacred power and cut off his hand. Even the priest was shocked by what was happening, but was in no hurry to help Luca. It wasn't hard to guess that the bully and his friend had decided to carry out their own justice. Moreover, the boys commanded the rest of the orphans to surround Luca, and the priest not to even try to protect the monster. The next minute, new knights rushed at the defenseless Luke. The priest tried to stop the boys, but his words were drowned out by the monster's hand, which broke through the ceiling of the shelter. A huge demon hung from the ceiling, trying to break through the roof and get to the people. Everyone around froze in fear, and the demon grabbed the crushed guy like a shrimp by the limb, and then he threw it into his mouth, which was so huge that it could be compared to a whale eating caplan. And then the monster reached for its next prey, which it found very easily. Luke was so frightened by this sight that he even forgot about his lost arm and the loss of blood. Zadira also looked at the monster. It seemed he was ready to rush into battle, but in fact he could not move. The priest at this time commanded the rest of the shelter to run and call the holy knights. It turns out that the bully could not move from the spot and run away, because he had taken an oath not to run away despite his fear. Now the boy fully understood the gravity and importance of the oath, but it was too late. Zadira began to scream and beg for help with tears in his eyes, but there was no one to save him. However, upon seeing their friend's death, the other orphans immediately remembered their new abilities. The newly converted decided to attack the demon together and save the orphanage. But the monster turned out to be not only big, but also very strong. He easily managed to catch orphans. Luke looked at what was happening and wondered what he could do and how he could help. Finally, having almost killed all the annoying orphans, the monster turned his attention to Luca. The demon's mouth opened and a huge, long tongue crawled out of it like a snake. Only at the end of the tongue there was a separate, huge jaw with fangs. Luke refused to acknowledge his death in the shelter that had become so boring to him, and remembered the cup. Before the jaw had time to close and swallow Luca, the boy drank the liquid in the cup in one gulp. At that very moment, some force pierced Luca like a long needle, pinning him to the spot, and the monster managed to get to our hero, blocking his escape route with its jaws. Finally, the jaw snapped shut, leaving a bloody mess underneath. A stream of blood rushed through the debris according to the laws of gravity. But after a minute, time seemed to turn back. The power of the cursed cup came forth, severing the demon's tongue and causing him to scream in pain. And in the place of the murdered hero, an unfamiliar long-haired boy appeared, whose strength sparkled like lightning. The lost arm was almost restored. The hero's strength was already growing on the tips of his fingers. It was the same Luca, who was surprised by the new body, but quickly accepted it. It was strange to him that the body was cold, as if lifeless, but at the same time filled with strength. The monster immediately decided to attack the guy with its claws, but Luca deftly ducked, and used the claws as a way to reach the demon's head. While the demon was going crazy with rage, Luke continued to climb up the monster. And then he jumped up to the monster's head and formed a pentagram. The pentagram transformed lightning, which literally blew up the demon. The demon fell to the floor, and only after that did Luca decide to land himself. As soon as the boy's feet touched the ground, the magic dissipated, and Luca took on his form. Luca fell on all fours. There was no strength left in his body. Even with this support, it was difficult. The bully's friend had been in the temple the whole time, and was amazed at the power of the one they thought was a monster. Luke was amazed that his lost hand had been completely restored, and was with him again. But his thoughts were interrupted by a huge sword that fell from the sky and pierced the demon's body. Luca stood up and noticed a figure on the hilt of the sword, which said that the demon cannot be left, otherwise miasma will spread. And then this girl apologized for coming late and asked Luke if he had defeated this demon. The girl of incredible beauty with scarlet hair looked at Luca without taking her eyes off him. Luke immediately recognized the stranger as a divine knight. The knight praised Luke, called Luke's victory a worthy achievement, and jumped off the sword. The red-haired one was the commander of the Divine Knights named Arthur. Luke was amazed by the size of the magic sword, as it spoke of the knight's power. Suddenly another knight ran up to the commander and scolded her for running ahead of them. Luke didn't yet know who Arthur was, but upon hearing of her status, he decided that he had to gain her recognition. After all, if she acknowledges him, then he will definitely be able to leave the shelter. That's why Luke immediately rushed to her, which amazed the girl commander. But the boy stood in front of her and bowed his head, declaring how much he admired knights. But his monologue was interrupted by the bully's friend, who demanded that the knights kill Luke. Arthur didn't understand why the guy had such an attitude towards Luca, but he hastened to inform her who Luca was. After mentioning that our hero was a famous baby, he became even more interesting to the commander and her assistant. Moreover, the guy told them something that was astonishing to them, that Luca had transformed without an oath. Of course, Luca hastened to justify himself and explain everything, but Arthur wasn't interested in that. She gave the bully's friend a flick on the face, and with such force that he rolled head over heels backwards several meters. Arthur explained that Luca had saved the boy and the others at the shelter, and she didn't like the tone in which they spoke about the savior. The bully's friend got scared and with tears in his eyes began to beg for mercy and apologize. Luke was shocked by this attitude and began to chew on himself. Luca became even more scared when Arthur turned to him and asked about the situation with the oath. Then Luke, out of fear, blurted out everything that had happened then, assuring that the knight had now drunk the contents of the cup. However, Arthur assured that the boy was not capable of gaining the power of a knight on this earth. The guy brought demons into this world, so there was a question with whom he made an oath. Luca was confused by the commander's words and began to babble, and the girl waited patiently. Realizing that Luca himself did not understand anything, she declared her interest in him and asked him to show strength. To make a decision, she needs to see her immediately. But Luca didn't control the circulation, so he was worried. Collecting his thoughts, Luca tried to explain in a way that would not fall in the commander's eyes, but she had already understood everything a long time ago, so, exhaling, she announced that she would resolve this issue quickly. Arthur grabbed the excited boy and lifted him up as easily as if he weighed nothing, and then she easily threw it high into the sky. It was so high that even the birds couldn't fly there, and the shelter building seemed smaller than a thimble. Her vocal abilities turned out to be even more amazing, because she managed to shout to Luca. While Arthur warned that Luca could crash, her assistant assured everyone that the monster here was herself. Meanwhile, Luca was already on his way back to the shelter, not understanding what was wrong with the girl and what he should do. And while Luca was trying to figure out how to address him, a demon in the form of a catfish noticed him. Once again, Luca played the role of a shrimp, not yet having the opportunity to do anything. Only now did Arthur remember that they were in the territory of the Heavenly Eaters, and if one of these demons eats you, your chances of survival are almost zero. The assistant commander had already rushed to help Luca, but Arthur stopped him. The girl decided that this was the perfect moment to see Luca's strength. She clearly believed in him. And the assistant only became convinced once again that he had never met a demon more terrible than his commander. At this time, Luca was inspecting the place of his temporary imprisonment. There was little comfort in the demon's stomach, especially the bones of his past victims. Just when he thought it was dangerous to linger here, he felt danger behind him. The demon's taste buds were approaching him from all sides, wanting to devour the guy. Luke only had to look back to think about his death again. And the image of the bully's last moment immediately appeared before my eyes. This animal fear of death and the possibility of returning to the shelter swept over the boy's consciousness. And a moment later, Luca turned around, not wanting at least to die in such a place. Fear turned into hellish flames and power that spread through his body. However, this was not enough. Luke needed a weapon, so he involuntarily created a sword. Those standing below saw nothing. The demon was still hovering in the sky. This lull had already begun to worry the assistant commander, but not Arthur. She herself had not yet decided on the boy, but she was concerned whether he would be useful. Finally, the first signs of resistance from Luke appeared. At first, the monster was thrown across the sky in pain, and then Luca burst out of its belly. Luke was flying down towards the ground, not even trying to slow down, and only just before landing, the shockwave slowed the fall. And as soon as Luca landed on the ground, he immediately acquired his basic form. The commander's assistant immediately ran to Luca to help, and was amazed that the guy didn't have a scratch on him. Meanwhile, Arthur announced that Luca was at least as strong as a vice commander. Arthur turned to her friend, wanting to know his opinion about the baby he had saved. It was Kiar who found the baby and was the only one who spoke out against his destruction. However, now Kiar thought that it would have been better for the boy to have died then. Meanwhile, Arthur hastened to turn to the bully's friend. The commander announced that Luca would now be under the personal supervision of the knights. Arthur explained that they were only human and could not choose their powers. Moreover, they don't have time to think about which forces to use to save the world. Luca slept for a long time after his rescue, so he didn't notice how he was packed into a flying carriage, and when he woke up, he found Arthur's face waiting for him to wake up. Luca jumped up in fright and started apologizing, trying to figure out where he was. Looking out the carriage window, Luca tried to examine the world around him and the Pegasi. Arthur explained that they had little time, so they left without waiting for him to wake up. While the girl was apologizing for not letting Luca say goodbye to his friends, the guy himself was thinking only about the fact that he had been accepted as a knight. This reaction did not surprise the girl, she merely confirmed what had been said. Now Luke is under the care of the Knights of Honor. Arthur hastened to congratulate him and shake the guy's hand. However, Luca was wary that she would now be under Arthur's personal supervision. Nevertheless, the handshake took place, but Arthur warned that they would be watching the guy. Finally, Luke asked about the future of his shelter. Kiar explained that the building had been damaged and would be demolished. The staff and children will be distributed among other shelters. Arthur watched Luca's reaction closely when he was told about the shelter. She asked again who he wanted to say goodbye to, but Luca said without explanation that there were none. After a short silence, Luca finally wondered where they were flying to. Arthur told about the sacred capital of Alpha and showed it on the horizon. Arthur mentioned the mystical era, a concept that was unfamiliar to Luke. Then Arthur, without further explanation, pointed to the sky for Luca. Luke didn't even have to look closely to notice a huge crack in the sky. The story of the appearance of demonic essence and monsters, enemies from another world. Those monsters were brought into the human world by the king of another world and the god of greed. That king created his servants, the demons of heaven, with whose help he destroyed the world of people. The Knights of the Order then managed to drive the king back into the crack and locked his servants in different parts of the world. This is why the number of people living in places has decreased so much, and the Order of Knights still doesn't know where the crack leads. However, since then the crack has become larger and has reopened, and only the Knights of the Order, whose numbers are not increasing, can resist this. Although Luke was born out of the terrible events of that time, the full story is only now coming to light. Arthur suddenly approached the guy and looked into his eyes, admitting that she really hoped for Luca's strength. Luca was embarrassed by the girl's closeness, but even more so by the fact that for the first time in his life, someone believed in him. Arthur took the guy by the chin, without opening his eyes, and told him about her feelings of something powerful coming from Luca. Arthur explained that everything about Luca is unique. The color of his eyes, which changes during his transformation, the color of his flames, and his new hand. Arthur was already whispering in the guy's ear that for the first time she was so strongly attracted to someone else's power. Moreover, Arthur is very interested in what Luke offered in the oath and to whom. The proximity of a beautiful girl and the first affectionate words in his life made the guy sweat from embarrassment. Arthur expressed hope that Luca would use his power for good. Arthur's sexual behavior was embarrassing, but Luca happily agreed to protect people. This was exactly the consent that Arthur was waiting for, so she threw Luca out of the carriage at that very moment. Luckily, Luca managed to react and landed deftly on the ground without being hurt. Moreover, like a cat, he first jumped onto a branch and then onto the ground like a cat. When Luca straightened up, he was surprised that his body was so light and there was not a drop of pain after landing. Arthur shouted from above about two types of powers, a magic sword like hers and a transformation like Luca's. Arthur said that the knight's job is not only to kill monsters, but also to get rid of trash. After cleaning up the trash, she demanded to run to the city and wished not to get lost along the way. Luca wasn't scared, but he was puzzled by what kind of trash the commander was talking about. But then I heard footsteps in the forest and saw a group of strange individuals. The gang leader also noticed Luca and was clearly not friendly towards him. The leader hastened to find out whether Luca was involved in the air carriages. Luca looked at the unfamiliar men in surprise, trying to understand who they were, and the man continued to talk about how the children in the forest were either abandoned or whose parents had been eaten. But for them it doesn't matter if this child can be sold, which Luca didn't like. However, now it became clear to Luca that by cleansing, Arthur meant getting rid of the bandits. While the bandits were saying something, Luca managed to notice a group of tied-up children behind them. One of them, small and apparently already beaten, reminded Luca of himself at his age. Luca ignored the bandits' words and demanded that the children be released. This disdain angered the leader so much that he gnashed his teeth. Luke decided to warn that this was his first task from the commander as a knight, and he would complete it. The bandits could not believe that one of the Knights of the Order was standing in front of them. However, they didn't care, because the guy had entered their territory. They didn't care about the law or the status of the bow. The bandits rushed at the guy in a crowd. However, when they landed, they discovered that they had not even touched the target. To their surprise, Luca's voice came from behind them. and it was extremely calm. Luca squatted and calmed the children whom the bandits planned to sell. Luca calmed the children down, then turned to their offenders and glared at them with a murderous look. Realizing that Luca was very fast, one of the bandits decided to attack with a crossbow. However, Luca disappeared before their eyes, and then appeared in another place. Then the bandit tried to use the crossbow again, hoping to achieve his goal. Luke only had to wave his hand, and the arrow flew past, smoldering in his hellish fire. Then Luke was engulfed in flames to transform into his night battle form. And then a demon, armed with a hellish sword, emerged from the flames towards the bandits. Luke was determined to end this fight in an instant, and he easily dealt with some of the bandits. He showed no mercy as he cut his enemies into pieces. Everything around him was ablaze with his flames, but he felt something was wrong. The bandit leader survived and took the boy hostage, demanding that Luca not move. The bandit warned that he would cut the child's throat if he noticed that Luca moved. Luca didn't know what to do, but when he noticed how the bandit's knife had drawn blood from the child, he decided to lower his sword. As a sign of obedience, Luca raised his hands and asked the bandit to let the child go. But the bandit refused. The children were a commodity he would not allow himself to lose. These children were easy targets because they had no parents. The bandit knew what the rich old fat perverts were doing to them, but he didn't care. But the bandit didn't have time to finish speaking. A whip of flame cut off his hand. The bandits were in pain not only from the cutting off, but also from the scorching flame. But the bandit did not suffer for long. Luca cut off his head the next moment. Luca, however, looked at everything with pure composure, only repeating that he had kept his promise and had not moved from his place. Luke lowered his hands and froze, thinking about what he had just done. The guy didn't expect that he would be able to direct his flame through the ground. After this, Luca approached the child and extended his hand, but the baby recoiled from him. Luca was not stupid and immediately realized that the baby might be scared, but to his surprise, the child hugged Luca. Even though the baby cried, he trusted Luca and was safe. In response, Luca sat down next to the baby and, stroking his head, let him cry it out. But the next moment, Luke lost his image and fell unconscious. At sunset, Kiar stood at the main gate waiting for Luke. When he noticed that the children brought Luca in unconscious, he became angry. The children were going crazy with anger at Luke, but they continued to pull the savior towards the palace. The children said that as soon as the boy carried them to the city, he fell down exhausted and asked to be carried here. Kiar lifted the boy up, complaining that Luca had acted extremely ignominiously by forcing the children to carry him. But Kiar was worried not about Luca, but about what awaited him inside the castle. And the commanders of the remaining detachments were waiting for him in the castle. Cutie Fran is the commander of the second squad of Holy Knights who thought Luca was cute. Kenneth was the second in command of the second squad, and was extremely distrustful of the newcomers. Grift, the commander of the fourth squad, considered it absurd to spend so much effort on a simple cleanup. Jack is the second in command of the sixth squad who has become disillusioned with Luke. But Arthur shamed her colleagues for being too cruel to the newcomer. She suggested continuing to observe the interesting boy. The commanders decided to support her in this decision. The next morning, a huge table of food awaited Luke, which he always raved about. Everything smelled so delicious that he immediately pounced on the food, sweeping away everything in sight. Unexpectedly, he was interrupted by Fran, serving water in a maid's costume. Luca felt awkward about his behavior, but the girl assured him that everything was fine. And again they addressed Luke very nicely, which made him embarrassed, but he was happy. In fact, he was in an ordinary cafeteria again, but everyone there was kind to him, and no one wanted to offend him. Now Luke felt at home and was glad that he had managed to join the Knights of the Order. And then Kenneth came to him, clearly unfriendly. Kenneth looked at Luke in silence for a moment, studying the newcomer. And then he came closer, peering at the carefree Luca. And then Kenneth turned around and left, saying that Luke had the face of an idiot. But in any case, he called Luca to follow him, making it clear that he was about to be tested. Luca jumped up from his chair, outraged by the stranger's insults. Finally, Kenneth introduced himself to Luke properly. And then Kenneth turned to that same maid, declaring that she should also go with him. Commander Fran was surprised to be called and addressed by her rank. Luca was amazed that the maid in front of him was a person of such high status. Luca was confused that he was accompanied by the second squad leader and her deputy. Luke was agitated, trying to remember the way. Fran noticed this and hastened to calm him down. And then, with the sweetest smile, she added that their main task is to survive. This calmness seemed strange to Luca, but he calmed down nonetheless. While Luke was trying to come to terms with the fact that Fran was dressed like a regular maid, Kenneth announced that they had arrived. This morning, a group of people saw monsters, so they were sent to clear the area. This is a good chance for Fran and Kenneth to see Luca in action. Fran admitted that the commanders discussed Luke and what to do with him. Luca couldn't believe that there would be a selection, and he could lose his new life. But the commander again hastened to assure the guy that she had big plans for him. Luca was quickly encouraged by Fran's words that she believed in him, and assured him that he would definitely cope with the task. However, Kenneth cut Luke off, questioning his words. Kenneth assured that if he and the commander decided that Luke was useless, they would throw him out of the Knights. This scared Luca, and the guy fell into a mad panic, and he was also madly angry. Luke was quick to express his indignation. He was indignant at why Kenneth was acting so arrogantly. Fran decided it was time to step in and make peace between the boys. Fran explained that Kenneth had taken an oath of honesty, even if it meant being cruel. At first, Luke wanted to forgive him, but then he realized that Kenneth was saying what he thought and considered him a fool, and he became even more angry. Kenneth spoke about how Luke gained power without making a pact. Luke was confused, not knowing where Kenneth was leading, especially since he himself had been trying to avoid these thoughts all this time. The deputy explained to the newcomer that the pact was the price paid for power. But Luke already knew without him that the greater the sacrifice, the greater the power. But Luca didn't have time to finish. The barrel of a pistol pressed to the back of his head stopped him. Our hero was amazed at how quickly Kenneth disappeared and appeared behind him. The deputy said that over the past 6 months, 1/3 of the new recruits have died. So Kenneth couldn't understand how anyone could join the order without sacrificing anything. Kenneth was about to shoot, but Fran interrupted him, grabbing the deputy's hand. However, Luke admitted that Kenneth was right, which surprised the deputy. Engulfed in flames, Luke admitted that he still had not made the pact. However, he had already received delicious food, a soft bed, and Arthur's recognition. He managed to escape from that hellish place called the orphanage, so he doesn't care about pacts and stuff. Having melted Kenneth's divine weapon, Luke declared that he would do everything to remain among the Knights. Kenneth was amazed by Luke's attitude and the fact that he melted his weapon. However, Kenneth immediately pulled himself together and summoned the gun again. But fortunately, Fran intervened in time and prevented the boys from fighting. In her sweet manner, Fran praised the boys for their energy and motivation. However, at the same moment she summoned her weapon, showing that this was not the time for quarrels. The boys didn't notice that they were surrounded by monsters, but now they clearly saw a crowd. Fran advised channeling the boys' energy into something useful. There were dangerous demons lurking in every corner of the forest around them, and they had to survive. The first demon attacked our group of knights, which greatly surprised Luke. Fortunately, the knights managed to dodge, but our hero was surprised by the demon's abilities. The demon itself looked like an ordinary gorilla, only its tail was longer and something was dripping from it. Moreover, this liquid on the tail, with one blow, demolished and dissolved the tree like acid. Kenneth, of course, warned that the tail was deadly, but a crowd of these monsters was already flying towards them. Luca dodged the attacks as best he could, but he still considered attacking in a crowd to be unfair, and it was at this point that Fran decided to leave the boys. The commander was sure that someone was leading the monsters, and she wanted to find this leader. Fighting back, the girl ran off to inspect the area. While Luca was trying to understand why the commander had abandoned them, Kenneth called for his pistols. And first of all, he pointed the gun in our hero's direction, so Luca immediately covered himself with his hands. But in fact, the shooter was aiming at the demon behind Luca's back. And then, with a contemptuous look, he shamed Luca for not taking his duties as a knight seriously. Luca was very angry that he was again looked down upon and even hated without reason. Luke immediately summoned a sword and cut into pieces the demon who wanted to attack from behind. Luke angrily declared that he would officially join the knights and would do everything to make it happen. Instead of fighting, the guys stood up, covering each other's backs. And Kenneth challenged Luke to prove his point by killing more demons than he did. Luca hacked and chopped, many bodies lay around him, and the guy was pretty tired. However, Kenneth continued to fire left and right, killing more and more demons time after time. There were mountains of demon corpses around the deputy. He clearly had his status for a reason. The number of dead did not even need to be counted to understand that Kenneth was winning their argument. Besides, Luke realized that he was clearly slower with the sword than Kenneth was with the pistol. While Luke killed 2, Kenneth shot twice as many. And Luca also realized that by increasing his flame, he was running out of breath faster. The deputy noticed that Luca had stopped and was catching his breath, so he took advantage of the moment to tease the guy. Such mockery hurt my pride, and I wish to become the best knight of Luke. Our hero noted that Kenneth did not stop shooting for a second and did not even get tired. Kenneth then explained that he maintains a steady flow of mana, and his weapon uses it measuredly, creating bullets. It was then that Luca realized that Kenneth had control over the mana, but he couldn't do that yet. However, if he continues to fight at the same pace, he will soon run out of steam. So Luke decided to do it all at once and win the argument. Kenneth immediately felt the call of mana in a large key and turned to Luca. But the deputy decided that Luke had given up, and became convinced that he had no place among the knights. Kenneth informed Luke that he would report his desertion when Fran returned. But suddenly he felt a lot of mana above him and raised his head, so he managed to see a huge sword. Kenneth couldn't believe that the boy had managed to repeat Arthur's trick. Luca explained that he doesn't understand tricks or mana control, so he'll just give it his all. Kenneth only managed to jump back as Luke pointed his sword at the epicenter of the demons. With a loud bang, the sword plunged into the ground, reducing everything in its path to dust. From above, Kenneth saw the crater left by the sword, not believing that the newcomer had enough strength to do such a thing. However, as soon as he landed, he saw Luca on the ground without strength. Luke hastened to boast to Kenneth that he had killed more than him. While Luke was chattering nonsense, Kenneth noticed that something was wrong with the demon's flesh. Kenneth realized it was a trap, but the boys didn't have time to escape. The ground beneath them collapsed, and the guys flew straight into the mouth of a huge, immense demon. Luke had enough mana to create a rope-like structure and cling to the edge of the cliff. Having managed to escape certain death, the guys hung over the demon, not knowing what to do. But earlier, Luca had used too much mana, and now he didn't have enough strength to support the rope. However, the demon did not wait for the rope to disappear, and grabbed his victim with his tongue. The boys were captured, but fortunately, the commander was already rushing to help. Fran didn't waste time saving the boys. She chose to head straight to the demon. Fran's weapon looked like a giant spoon, which she swung to attack. But first, Fran had grown her spoon to gigantic proportions, and picking up the demon like a berry on a cake, she threw him into the air. Under the huge mouth that was instead of a head, a small body was hidden. Fran turned her weapon into a knife and jumped after the demon. In the air, the commander cut the demon into pieces in an instant. The guys also fell down with their tongues cut off. Fran deftly jumped to the ground and praised the guys for their work. The girl explained that she felt this demon, but knew that it would not appear in her presence. Moreover, she is glad that the boys were able to become friends so quickly. While the boys were freeing themselves from the demon's tongue, Luca looked at Fran. Luke was amazed that the girl had destroyed such a demon so quickly, but he was even more amazed that she was praying. Fran explained that all demons were once humans, so she always prays for their souls. These people were unlucky enough to find themselves in the epicenter of the miasma, become infected, and turn into demons. But Kenneth interrupted this dialogue, stating that what was happening seemed strange to him. The guy had never heard of a source of magic in this area, especially so close to the capital. Fran clarified that there were applicants, but she also found it strange. At that moment, Fran felt a foreign energy and commanded to run. The boys hesitated, although they had no chance to escape anyway. Someone appeared to our heroes and was able to pin them to the spot with his energy. Fran immediately recognized the demon, and the stranger continued to be even more indignant that his creation had been destroyed. The stranger accused people of cruelty. He believed that this demon was his best creation. Fran understood that in front of her was a demon of the commander rank, but she didn't know who was in front of her. But the stranger had no intention of greeting them. He waved his finger and forced the knights to lie face down on the ground. The pressure was so strong that our heroes were actually pressed into the ground. Luca couldn't believe that there were demons that could even hurt someone as strong as Fran. Kenneth, of course, tried to resist and called for his gun, but the demon was not in the mood to allow such liberties to people, and immediately attacked the guy. A wave of the demon's finger was enough to break the guy's arm. After this, the stranger stated that he would reassemble the killed demon. The remains of the slain demon immediately began to rise into the air and grow together. Luca couldn't believe that before his eyes the stranger was recreating the demon, as if it were made of plasticine. And literally a couple of minutes later, a new demon stood in front of him. The new demon grabbed Fran by the head and lifted her off the ground, and the commander could do nothing. Then the demon's mouth, hidden behind the two halves of the brain, opened. Luke again watched the scene as a man he knew was about to be eaten by a demon. The thought of Luca losing a good person in his life scared him so much that he turned to God. No one present could believe that anyone would have the strength to resist the stranger. But Luca, through the pain, turned, hurrying to rush at the demon and save his new friend. This fear of Luke turned into the madness of his fighting form. Not only was Luke able to turn and stand up, but he also summoned a ball of fire. And then he launched it at the monster, destroying it on the spot and freeing Fran. It was clearly hard for Luke to maintain this form. He was pouring out sweat. Only after he saw that there was nothing left of the monster did he allow himself to turn around. The stranger had been watching Luca all this time, clearly understanding who Luca was, and then he burst into exclamations about how amazing Luca was, that he was able to move in his magnetic field. But the stranger was even more interested in the fire that was not from this world that Luca was using. The stranger lifted Luca into the air and came up to look our guy in the eyes, and he was amazed that behind the human gray-blue eye there was hidden the scarlet eye of a demon. The stranger was amazed by the discovery, and the fact that he saw a man who had made a pact with a god from another world. Unlike Luke himself, the stranger was able to find out the price of this pact. The stranger was amazed at what the man had sacrificed and laughed at it, but suddenly his laughter stopped, and his face was distorted, either from pain or from the fact that he did not believe what had happened. While the stranger was studying Luca, he didn't notice how our hero pierced his chest with his fire. Luca had spent a lot of energy, but he was still conscious and burning with the desire to protect his friends. In an instant, the stranger's body was torn to pieces, and after the demon fell, the gravitational field disappeared and Luke fell to the ground. Kenneth and Fran hurried to get up and go to Luke to make sure he was alive. Kenneth couldn't believe that Luke had defeated the stranger, and Fran was examining the remains of the dead man. The girl hurried to throw the things off the demon and made sure that it was a doll in front of her. Fran couldn't believe that someone could control the doll and transmit such power so easily from a distance. Kenneth didn't understand why Luke wasn't moving, and both of them hurried to examine him. Imagine their surprise that the guy was just sleeping. He was very tired. Fran was much more worried about the doll and whoever was controlling it. The girl dug into the bits of information about the enemy and was frightened by her own guess. This powerful force clearly belonged to the magic master, the ruler of Tempest. Meanwhile, a little girl was hurrying to the ruler of Tempest himself, who was somewhere in his village. The girl ran into the master's house and was outraged that he was sleeping again. Tempest was indeed lying on the sofa, covered with a book. The girl scolded her older brother for lying around doing nothing in the middle of the day. Tempest apologized to the little girl, explaining that he had had an interesting dream. He admitted that his heart was pounding from sleep, and the little girl immediately realized that he had been caught in his sleep and scolded him for it. Tempest was too lazy to move, so he poured himself a cup of tea with magic, and the little girl used the moment to scold her brother again for being lazy. And then they both leaned back on the sofa and looked at it with a crack that seemed incredibly beautiful to them. Meanwhile, our knights were reaching the knightly order, with Kenneth carrying Luke. Moreover, the guy encouraged Luca, asking him to hold out until the capital. However, Luca himself was far from what was happening to him in the real world. Luke's thoughts unconsciously revolved around the pact and its victims. While Luca was unconscious, the commanders and their deputies discussed his contract. The guy was brought into the dungeon and looked at with obvious distrust. The first to speak out was Commander Grift, who considered the boy's existence to be contrary to the meaning of their order's existence. However, his deputy reminded him that this guy had created an absurdly huge spiritual weapon. Kiar supported Jack, assuring him that the boy could be useful. But the man at the head of the table didn't think so, since the doll's details were still unknown. This man was Gava's deputy commander, and wanted to wait for the facts. Arthur followed the dialogue closely, but did not intervene yet. When everyone had spoken, Arthur asked Fran to share her opinion. Fran was still confused by what had happened and needed time to collect her thoughts. The girl preferred to speak with facts, saying that only Luca managed to move in that field. And if he hadn't been able to resist the doll, the three of them would have definitely died. Only she realized that Luca himself was not able to control his powers. Then Gava decided to clarify about the boy's exhaustion after using his powers. He believed that the guy definitely had no control over his powers, and pushed the idea that it was dangerous. Arthur thought about Gav's words and Fran's opinion. However, she concluded that they simply needed to find out if Luke's power was suitable for their order. So now the question was how to convince Gava of the guy's usefulness. Gava maintained a moment of silence for appearance's sake, and then declared that the boy must pass the flame protection test. This test seemed too harsh to everyone. No one expected it. However, Arthur easily accepted this condition and asked Jack to patch up Luca. At that moment, Luca was tormented by a dream from old memories, apparently from when he made the pact. These voices in his sleep, the memories of the shelter, tormented him, and he jumped up upon awakening. Luca woke up already in the room, but did not understand where he was. Fortunately, Kenneth was sitting next to him. Kenneth remained calm, reading a book by the boy's bed. The deputy explained that Luca had been cured by the skill, but the doll was no longer there. Kenneth wanted to say something else, but he hesitated and became embarrassed, which did not escape Luke's attention. Kenneth felt awkward, but he still thanked Luke for saving him. And to Luca's great shock, the shooter admitted that he was worried about his new comrade, and these words, clearly spoken sincerely, pleased Luca. But Kenneth, who didn't want to show his sweet side, was very embarrassed. And at that moment someone entered the room with a firm step, interrupting the guy's dialogue. Kiar felt awkward interrupting the patient's peace, but the time had come for the test. Apologizing for the disturbance, Kiar announced that Luca's future had been decided. Kiar announced a test of flame protection, but this was the first time Luca had heard of such a thing. But Kenneth was indignant, and this reaction shocked Luca, which meant that something was wrong with the test. Kenneth tried to defend the newcomer, citing seemingly logical arguments. But Kiar didn't care. He just concluded his speech by saying that he had been appointed as the overseer of the trial. Luke was interested in whether, if he passed the test, he would be recognized as a knight. Kiar explained that this test is only assigned on the recommendation of commanders. Since this test was only for the more experienced, Kenneth considered it to be pure murder. So Kiar also explained that only a few pass this test, and a third of them go crazy. Kiar could only advise Luca to approach the test as if it were his death. Luca swung his legs off the bed and stared at the floor, explaining that he didn't understand everything yet. However, the order is the last place he has left, and he will do everything to stay in it. 5 days later, Kiar personally led Luca to the cave where the test would take place. The test consists of 2 main parts. The first is to survive inside a cave for 3 days, which is difficult in itself. Luca saw Kiar's seriousness, so he also took the instructions seriously. For the second part of the test, Kiar gave Luca a candle. Kiar advised Luca to pour power into the candle, which the boy tried to do. After which the candle flared up, burned and frightened Luca himself. Kiar explained that Luca's job was to make sure the flame didn't go out. This flame will attract the monsters that live in the cave. Now Luca began to understand what kind of hell awaited him in 3 days. And after that, Kiar announced that the test was beginning, and it was time for Luke to enter the cave. Luke walked slowly through the cave, not even trying to illuminate the walls. The cave looked ordinary so far, and no monsters were visible. However, Luca felt that the further he went, the harder it was to breathe. In this cave, the concentration of magical essence was greater than in the north. Luca remembered Kiar's words about there being more monsters here. They are also more aggressive than in other regions. And then the first one showed up, clearly intending to attack. Luke not only needs to hold on, but also not let the candle burn out. While Luca was thinking over his plan of action, while he was destroying the first monster, it turned out to be easy. Just a couple of sword strikes were enough. However, he could not contain his energy, and the candle melted considerably. Luke needed to learn to control his strength first. Suddenly, Luca heard the sound of a bell and remembered Kiara's words about it, after which a crowd of all kinds of monsters began to flock to him. Luke had to go through all this in order to survive and get out of the cave in 3 days. It was then that Luca realized that it was impossible to endure all this. Kenneth was right when he called it murder. Kiar and Kenneth watched the test through a fake monster. Kiar noticed that Kenneth was worried about the newcomer and even started to sweat. The longer he looked, the more he realized that the test was impossible for the inexperienced Luca. Then Kiar explained that the commander had clearly given such an order because someone in the order was not happy with the boy. And for them to accept Luke, he needs to do something crazy and impossible. Suddenly, Kiar noticed something he certainly didn't expect from the newcomer. So he told Kenneth that he believed in the guy and his victory. However, Kenneth didn't believe it yet, because the guy could only dodge. Luca could only dodge as the sword's summoning melted the candle. Then Luke decided that he needed to act for sure and once. Luca decided to pour more power into the candle and attract more monsters to himself, and then destroy them all at once and live out the rest of their days in a cave in peace. The monsters attacked Luca in a crowd, and that's what he was waiting for. Luke didn't transform, but used hellfire. The guy released all his energy, burning all the monsters and risking burning the candle. But fortunately, the candle remained. But the site of the battle was reduced to ashes. Kiar and Kenneth were surprised by the newcomer's behavior. However, the knights quickly understood the guy's goal, but doubted that it was according to the rules. However, Kiar appreciated the newcomer's plan. The boy wasn't going to give up, and he liked it. Kiar was still worried, but now he began to believe in the newcomer even more. However, Kiar noticed that something was wrong with the test. There was an extra monster in the cave. The commander realized that Gavin had planned to kill the newcomer, and had sent a special monster. Meanwhile, only a third of Luke's candle remained, which still had to be stretched out for 3 more days. Therefore, Luke decided to hide in a small cave and wait it out. But as soon as Luca had adjusted the candle flame, someone attacked him from behind. Luke was very lucky because the wall he hit was broken. Luke quickly jumped up to examine his new opponent. And to his surprise, it turned out to be some kind of robot in the likeness of a spider. Luca didn't understand what kind of monster it was or how to act, but he was ready to defend himself. Kiar, at the magic cauldron, watched everything and was angry at Gavin for sending Bersirak. This monster was created by the Order of Knights themselves to destroy monsters, and since he attacked Luke, he identified him as a monster. Kiar immediately called Havana and scolded him for using a weapon during the exam. At this time, Gavin sat calmly in his office and watched the exam through a mirror. Gavin admitted that he sent the robot prototype to the testing ground, but allegedly had no involvement in its attack on Luca. Kiar, of course, did not believe Gavin's words, but he could not do anything. In any case, Gavin warned that the exam could not be interrupted. On this note of passive-aggressive aggression, the call ended. And at that moment, Fran entered Gavin's office, bringing tea and a lot of sugar. Gavin immediately rushed to scold the commander for lowering herself in such a way by playing the role of a servant. However, Fran herself was happy with her hobby, laughing that Gavin gave up sugar to look stern. But Fran didn't miss the fact that Gavin was in a good mood. Gavin wanted to get rid of the boy in order to bring peace back to the order. The monster camera continued to follow our hero. Meanwhile, Luca continued to dodge the robot's laser, but it was difficult for him. The robot shot too accurately. Luca barely managed to jump back at the last minute. Luca decided to attack the robot from behind and set it on fire. Luca expected not to win with the first blow, but hoped to knock him down. However, there was not even a scratch on the robot. It was still combat ready. Besides the fact that a robot was running towards Luca, the problem was that the candle was almost burnt out. But the robot didn't give him time to think. He attacked the guy with a laser again. Luca decided not to pour any more power into the candle. It was not having any effect. However, he still didn't know what to do, so he decided to jump into the crevice. Now there was distance between the robot and our hero, and this could be used. While Luca was thinking about the robot's weakness, he had already calculated everything and was ready to attack. But suddenly Luca realized that the robot had stopped attacking. It had simply frozen at the edge. But this was only for a couple of minutes, after which the robot took aim and attacked again. Then Luca realized that the robot attacks according to the steps. If Luca stands still, then it is invisible. Then Luca decided to attack the robot head-on and ran straight at it, after which he tripped the robot and made it lose its balance. The robot began to fall over and cut itself with swords, and Luca used the moment to attack. With one blow, Luca broke the iron thing's eye and tore out its insides. Luca hoped he had finished off the last one, because there was almost nothing left of the candle. But the guy was glad that he was able to handle such a dangerous thing on his own. And Gavin, who was watching him, even got up from his chair in surprise. Fran, who was watching nearby, was overjoyed that her dear Luca had done it. The robot was defeated, and this upset Gavin so much that he asked Fran for sugar. Having poured in about 10 pieces, Gavin mixed everything thoroughly. While the man washed down his bitter frustration with super sweet tea, Fran was happy. After which, Gavin sent Fran on her way, scolding her for being idle. Gavin was so angry at Luca's victory that even the cup shook in his hands. Gavin, of course, played it safe by sending a robot. But he still hoped that the cave wouldn't let the guy go so easily. Luca sat out all 3 days successfully, although he was quite tired of maintaining the flame. Luca waited for the sound of the last bell, the end of the exam. Besides, the candle had very little time left, just like him. Although Luca was already weak and very sleepy, he managed to notice that something was wrong with the monster's flesh. The remains of the monsters began to vibrate and then move. And to his surprise, these pieces were moving in his direction. They were approaching him. But that's not all. They somehow strangely stretched out and reached out to each other. The remains of the monsters began to regenerate and turn into monsters again. Finally, the bell rang and there were still some candles left. All the conditions were met. Now it was time for the guy to get out of the cave. And while the candle was still burning, Luke had to make his way through the newly appeared monsters. Meanwhile, the flame had become so vulnerable that it could go out at the slightest breath. Luca ran from the monsters as best he could, covering the remains of the flame with his other hand. The guy tried to support himself with his last strength, because he had become so weak that he could not fight. There was very little time left until the exit. There was already light at the end of the tunnel, but Luca was wounded in the back. Even so, Luca continued to reach for the light. There was only a little left to be saved. Suddenly, someone commanded Luca to duck and attack the monsters covering him. With one blow, all the monsters were destroyed, and Luca was saved. The boy fell at the very threshold of the cave, and his examiner stood in front of him. Luckily for Luca, Kiara announced that the exam was over and he was able to keep the candle flame alive. At this point, Luca's strength left him and Kiara had to help the boy get up. Luca was already unconscious, so he couldn't hear Kiara praising him. Luca woke up already on a chair in some large hall, but he was not alone, and they immediately explained to him that the guy was in the ceremonial hall. And Commander Arthur was in full dress. The guy was clearly expecting good news. All the commanders and their deputies gathered in the hall, surrounding the guy. Arthur announced the beginning of the ritual dedicated to the one who passed the fire protection test. The Holy Knightly Order will bear its oath in hands to prove its loyalty to the new recruit. Kiar started first, and talked about his vow to never start a family. Next was Fran, who gave up food to live. Deputy Kenneth promised to be honest at all times, and in everything. Captain Grift sacrificed his right arm in the name of God and gained power. Jack promised God to always remain a virgin and received the power of healing. Luke listened carefully to each one, and understood that these knights had rejected the foundation of human life. The last to speak about the oath to never sleep was the deputy commander of the order, Gavin. But it turns out that the shield of Gavin also had an oath to never forgive those who betray the order. Finally, it was Arthur's turn, who raised her sword above her head. Arthur had rejected her gender. She could no longer be a girl and allow herself weakness. Now it was Luke's turn. He too had to show his weapon and recite the oath. Everyone around began to watch Luca closely, because until now, no one knew his oath. Luke could easily show off his weapon by transforming into his combat form. Although Luke used fire, it was the evocation that was his primary weapon. After which, Luca returned to himself again, not knowing what to say. Just like at the shelter, Luca introduced himself and started talking about the oath, but hesitated. He understood that acknowledging the oath was a sign of trust, but he admitted that he did not know his oath. Luke still didn't know what he had sworn to gain such power. However, Luke vowed that he would win the Order's trust and prove his loyalty. Luke doesn't want to see others suffer anymore, so he promises to save them before it happens. Although the recognition of the oath was important, the Knights of the Order accepted it. Arthur announced that the Order accepted the guy's determination, after which he loudly announced that Luke had been accepted into the sacred knightly order. After which, all the knights placed their fists on their chests, showing their loyalty to the new knight. And above Luke, a sacred light lit up, signifying divine approval. Amidst general chatter and congratulations, Arthur quietly left the hall. But he was caught up by Gavan, who condemned Arthur for accepting the boy without an oath. But Arthur reminded that the exam conditions had been met, and the boy had proven his worth. Not knowing his own oath was primarily dangerous for Luke himself, and he took this risk. But Gavin said that the guy's power itself was wrong, and could threaten the Order. But Arthur noted that the guy's flame is stronger the closer Luca is to death. So this is to their advantage. And while these two were worried about the future, Luca and the others were enjoying the present. After some time, our heroes set off on their next mission. The train was heading towards the western main street, which was only a couple of hours away. The knights sat in a special reserved carriage. Luke, in his usual way, was delighted to be recognized by the knights and to be setting out on a mission. Simple-minded Luca was glad that now he definitely wouldn't have to return to the shelter. The boy was not afraid of the impending danger and the possibility of death. Life in the Order seemed like a fairy tale to him. A conductor approached our heroes and offered them some food. Luca immediately became embarrassed, because he didn't have a penny to pay. However, the girl assured him that it was a gift, and Luca was even more delighted with the free food. But Jack hastened to assure the guy that it was not for free, because they paid for such an attitude with their lives. Jack happily ate everything that was brought, tapping his chest. Luke looked at the modest food that had been brought and thought about Jack's words, but he didn't think too deeply about it, because he was ready to sacrifice himself if he wasn't bullied anymore. Luke didn't quite understand what Jack was worried about, because for him, being in the Order only meant doing his duties well. And Kenneth decided to move on to the question of why they were going west. The Western Territory was under Jack's jurisdiction, so it turns out he needed help. Indeed, the activity of monsters in the West has increased greatly recently. The West requested support, and this explained the number of newcomers and knights in the carriage. Well, Luke understood this part, but he had one more question. Why is Deputy Kenneth going with them, accusing him of idleness? But it turned out that Commander Fran asked Kenneth to look after Luke. Jack watched the boys argue and it made him laugh. But suddenly Luca turned to Jack. Something was bothering the boy. It turns out that Luke was worried about Jack's vow to remain a virgin. Of course, Jack was embarrassed and outraged by the newcomer's impudence. But then Jack laughed again, mocking that God certainly wouldn't have accepted the same oath from Luke. The thing is, the price of Jack's virginity is different from that of those who have never been in love. For others, virginity is stupidity, but for Jack it is a sacrifice. Jack decided to explain this using the example of Fran, who swore by food. Food isn't that important to humans, but for her it must have meant something closer to her heart. Luke didn't quite understand what that meant yet, but he seemed to grasp the basic principle. Now Luca understood what Arthur's price really was, because she was essentially no longer living her own life. But I decided to clarify this point with the guys anyway. It was then that Jack revealed that Arthur was actually a princess. The previous commander was Arthur's half-brother, and after his death, she inherited the position. For someone who has been raised as a princess all her life, a vow means a lot. Now Luca understood where Arthur got such incredible strength from. Suddenly, Kenneth grabbed Luke by the cheek, tearing him out of his thoughts. Kenneth demanded to stop thinking about it out of idle curiosity, because the oath is personal for everyone. Jack advised to wait until the knights began to trust him, and told him everything themselves. Our heroes were so engrossed in their conversation that they didn't notice a stranger enter the carriage. The stranger called himself Duga, and announced himself as a conductor. The conductor found the name strange and stopped serving the knights. The girl didn't know the person standing in front of her, so she immediately asked who he was. But as soon as he showed his face, it became clear that he was not human. After which he waved his hands, and Jack immediately reacted. Jack managed to grab Kenneth and Luke, saving them from the stranger's attack. And when the guys turned around to look at the stranger, they noticed that he was a demon. And in the carriage, besides them, there were no survivors left. Everyone died from the demon's thorns. The carriage became a slaughterhouse. Only instead of pigs, there were young people dreaming of protecting everyone. Only one remained on his feet, and he began to turn into a demon. Without thinking, Luca rushed to his aid, unaware of the danger. Kenneth immediately began yelling at Luke, which distracted our hero from the newly converted. The desire to save cost Luca his left arm, which the demon tore off. Once again, Luke lost his left arm due to a loss of vigilance. Luca screamed in pain, and Jack was already thinking about saving him. Jack couldn't believe the transformation happened so quickly. And then Duga appeared again, introducing himself as Lord Tempest's servant. Duga promised to destroy all who stood in the way of his highly respected lord. While Kenneth was thinking about the connection between his current opponent and the past, Luca was attacked from behind. But Kenneth managed to shoot the newly converted demon in time and at the same time take aim at Doug. Amazingly, Kenneth was able to cut off the head of the one who possessed the power to create new monsters. At this time, Jack hurried to Luke to heal his wound. Jack's skill was called Fairy Tear, and it looked like a pixie doll. While the doll was busy healing, Jack himself could protect the patient. The fairy immediately flew down to get the severed arm, and then with all her might put it back in its rightful place. And as soon as the femmes used magic, the entire carriage was illuminated with golden light. And when she finished, with the pride of an older sister, she patted Luca on the back. Luca couldn't believe that his arm was returned to him, and there was no hint of injury. The man who suddenly fell dead from having half his head cut off clapped his hands. The demon admired the divine power that made pathetic people worthy of his attention. Duga stood up, and the knights saw that his head was recovering. Duga declared that this power would not help them. Now he would definitely kill the knights. And our heroes were attacked by the demon that Kenneth thought he had killed. The rookie moved with astonishing speed and attacked the deputies. Jack realized that the demon was strong not because of the physical characteristics of this body, but because of the magic invested in it. Meanwhile, the remaining wounded knights were treated and headed to the carriages to join the civilians. Luca was the first to detain the demons, but he did not kill them right away. And he decided to reach the knight's consciousness by reminding him of his duty. But suddenly Jack's blade pierced the demon's head. Luke was amazed that their former comrade was killed so easily. So Jack was quick to explain that there was no turning back. Jack continued to dodge and explain that the order exists to protect people. And sometimes you have to sacrifice your comrades, and if Luke can't, then he should leave the order. Kenneth decided to at least smooth things over a little, and asked Luke to stop the demons from attacking civilians. Only now did Luca notice that the conductor had survived in this house and was hiding in the corner. Our hero immediately grabbed her hand and pulled her into the carriage to the civilians. As soon as Luca ran to the people, he started screaming about monsters with a siren. And then they demanded that everyone go to the front of the carriages, but people were in no hurry. However, Luke's scream made everyone come to their senses and finally run for their lives. However, there was a girl with 4 small children in the carriage and she could not escape. And it was at that moment that the door to the carriage was broken down, which frightened the children even more. One of the demons finally broke through and had already spotted people to attack. But Luke stood before the family, calling upon his sword and indicating that he would protect the people. Luke didn't wait for the demon to approach himself. He decided to increase the distance between him and the people. And when he retreated to a safe place, with a clap of flame he took on his battle form. He also summoned a sword that reached the ceiling of the carriage, clearly not thinking about the energy consumption. Although he had no time for it now, Luca was consumed by the emotion of protecting people. To begin with, he decided that it was necessary to prevent the possibility of other demons getting to people. Luke cut off his car from the cars with demons, thereby isolating the demons, and then returned to his comrades. Even Doug praised the boy for his intelligence. When Luca returned to his friends, Duga admitted his outdated information. However, our hero was not at all interested in the fact that the demons did not know about a fighter with the strength level of an officer. Instead, Luke assured that he would kill the demon, with a percentage for killing all the recruits. It seemed that Duga liked the enemy's fighting spirit, and assured that he had prepared some entertainment for the knights. Duga didn't go into detail, but he began moving his fingers as if he were controlling puppets. Luca immediately understood the hint, and immediately flared up, throwing himself into battle with insults. However, Jack stopped the boy in time and, putting his hand on his head, pointed to the changes on the train. Something strange was happening with the remains of the corpses, and one touch of it could cost a life. However, He also wasn't going to stand idle and suggested that the guys race to cut off the demon's head. But Duga himself did not appreciate the game. Rather, he looked at the people with disdain. After which he gave the command, and the corpses immediately rushed into battle, defending Duga. Although Jack's strength was in healing, his body was well trained and he fought skillfully. Kenneth not only destroyed demons, but also covered the backs of his friends. But our hero decided to act head-on, as always, without avoiding the enemy's attacks. But the demons didn't know that Luke's hellish flames would easily burn their tentacle, and it would be better not to come into contact with the guy. While the others fought off the newly converted, Jack made his way to Duga. Jack was sure that he would cut off the demon's head, but it quickly turned into slime and took on another form. After which, in his new form, Duga escaped from the carriage, and Jack had to chase after him. However, as soon as Jack ran into the next carriage, it turned out that there was no one in it. But Jack understood that it was impossible to escape so quickly. The demon was hiding somewhere. Looking closer, Jack noticed traces of blood leading into one of the compartments. Looking into it, Jack saw a bleeding man who could still be saved. Jack decided that he was looking at a real conductor and rushed to save him. Jack rushed to call upon the holy power of the fairy tier, but he was interrupted. The knight did not expect that the man would turn out to be a setup, and that this trick would be used for an attack. As soon as Jack was wounded, the wounded man laughed hysterically, his mouth widening. After which the demon jumped away from Jack and began to mock the knight's gullibility. After which the human mask began to float away from the demon, and a new demon appeared. It turned out that the new demon is Duga's younger brother. And unlike the reserved Doogie, he had more extravagant behavior and a body the size of a monkey. However, as soon as Jack rose to attack, the little one again turned his finger into a long point. This demon's strength and cruelty were clearly not inferior to his brother's. He wanted to throw Jack's body out the window. And for precisely following the commands, the elder Duga praised his younger brother Dolce. Even on the brink of death, Jack wanted to know where the real conductor was, and Dolce laughingly told him that he had thrown him off the train long ago. At that moment, Kenneth ran into the carriage and immediately hurried to help Jack. And Duga just continued to laugh, that if you think about it, it's extremely easy to kill the Knight Commander. But suddenly a whip of hellish fire burst into the carriage and cut off the hands of Dolce and Duga. The younger demon immediately screamed in pain, but Duga held back his scream, only clenching his teeth tighter. Of course, it was Luca who joined his comrades, and he was outraged by the demon's words about the commander. Luca promised that he, a mere knight, would cut off Duga's clever head. Luke stood in front of his friends, cutting them off from the demons. The deep wound and pool of blood under Jack frightened Kenneth, so the boy hurried to call the fairy. The fairy hurried to treat the owner, but warned that since she needed more time to summon him while he was unconscious. But in an instant, both demons grew their arms back, as if the wound had never happened. The demons clearly couldn't fight against two knights, so they decided to separate them. Dolce broke through the roof of the carriage, and Duga suggested that Luca solve the problem from the outside, after which both demons dived into the hole made in the ceiling. Kenneth didn't like this arrangement. He didn't want to leave Jack unattended. But Luca didn't ask for help. On the contrary, he asked his friend to guard the fairy while she was healing Jack. Luke heard behind him that he could trust Kenneth, and he went to catch up with the demon. On the roof, Duga said that demons attack people to lead them to the abyss of hell, for the sake of their master. Amidst all the demon's speech, Luke caught that their master was also heading west. But Duga didn't want to talk about it. He was already looking forward to the fight. When the train brought them under the bridge, it became so dark that Luca could not see anything. Luckily, Luke noticed small lights approaching him from afar. They turned out to be bats turned into demons, but Luke deftly cut them down. However, there was no end to the creatures, and Luke needed to find their leader to stop it all. And suddenly our hero sensed that one of these creatures was right behind him. But luckily the creature was shot, torn apart by Kenneth's bullets. Kenneth stood on the roof of the train, wanting to make sure that Luke was not injured. Kenneth stood with his back to Luke and promised to have his back. And at that moment Duga appeared, assuring that he would now definitely kill the knights. Duga transformed his body again and attacked Luca, who was not at all surprised. Luca was calm, as if he knew the upcoming battle in advance and could anticipate his opponent's attacks. Without a shadow of a doubt, Luke grabbed Kenneth and immediately held him in front of himself as a shield. And what's amazing is how Kenneth's body was pierced like a piece of soft polymer clay. Ever since Kenneth appeared on the roof of the train, Luke knew it was one of the demons. After all, if Kenneth said he would look after Jack, then you can be sure that he will not break his word. Luca was inspired by the fact that for the first time he could so unconditionally trust someone's word. Literally. Having burst Dolce's head and killed the monster completely, Luca rushed towards Duga. In one leap, Luca caught up with Duga and grabbed him by the head, intending to raise him to the ground. First, he pressed the demon's body against the wall of the tunnel, mocking that he couldn't handle even an ordinary night. By the end of the tunnel, all that remained of the demon's body was a pitiful piece of sternum and half a head. Looking at the demon's remains, Luke was unhappy that he hadn't cut off his head for Jack. However, he was satisfied with the demon's imminent death and the fact that Jack would forgive him for such an inaccuracy in the argument. Luke stood and watched as the demon's body smoldered, disintegrating before his eyes. And only after there was nothing left of the demon did he take on his true form. But suddenly, the guy saw a body in the distance on the tracks. Someone was standing there, blocking their way. The closer they got, the more Luca could see of the armed young lady. Luke hastened to warn Kenneth about the new guest, which alarmed the boy. Kenneth looked out the window and immediately recognized the commander of the 6th Squad, Bridget. Without a shadow of a doubt, the lady threw her hammer above herself and then brought it down with a crash onto the railroad tracks. The boys were amazed that ice began to approach the train at great speed, blocking the road and the train. The train stopped a meter from the commander and her comrades who surrounded her. While the guy was waiting to see what would happen next, the commander had already flown into the carriage. She walked confidently towards her deputy, his barely audible request to give him a minute. And then, without a shadow of doubt or compassion for the wounded man, she began to slap the guy on the cheeks. And then she began to demand that the situation be reported to her, clearly hoping that the deputy would come to his senses quickly. Surprisingly, Jack, surprised by the personal presence of his beloved commander, immediately came to his senses. Moreover, he called the young lady Her Majesty, which amazed Luke and Kenneth. Finally, Jack was able to get to his feet, and everyone gathered for a small meeting. While Jack reported to the commander, Luke and Kenneth watched the strange couple closely. The boys already understood that Jack had taken a vow of celibacy out of love, apparently love for the commander. But this was not how they had imagined it. However, as soon as Bridget turned to the guys to clarify the information she had received, they immediately became serious. The commander immediately began giving orders to the team to report new information to the base. She also ordered us to find a carriage with civilians and help them. Bridget called Jack, Luke, and Kenneth with her. She already guessed where the demon master was heading. Luke didn't yet know the details of the past, so he asked Kenneth about the demon mage's status. Kenneth didn't know everything either, but presumably Tempest was the one who opened the hole in the sky to summon the Demon King. This demon magician is the one who turned people into demons and is to blame for all the suffering. Luca couldn't believe that the last time he met such a legendary creature. Bridget took a group of guys to the desert, to the heavenly demonic temple, where Tempest is most likely going. Luca intervened in the commander's monologue, expressing his opinion that the castle was just a fairy tale. But it was no fairy tale. The knights banished the king, dividing his body into parts, which became independent demons. One of them controlled the weather, sending lightning strikes to the earth. Another burned cities and even erased stones with his fire. Another one flooded cities for no reason, creating water out of nowhere. And then the last demon divided the earth and tore it apart. The knights of that time could only fight stupidly. But they managed to build castles in different parts of the world and seal the demons there. However, the miasma of the heavenly demons is so terrible that the water demons sealed here turned the earth into a desert. After all the history, Bridget finally got around to the information that the boys were dating the creator of demons. The commander admitted that the center assumed the possibility of communication with Tempest M, but it would be worth checking everything. The Sky Demon is definitely a disaster, but Tempest, who can summon the Demon King again, is already epic. And if the Demon Mage succeeds in summoning the heavenly demons, then he will be able to turn them into a king again. Luke immediately realized that Tempest was ahead of the knights in his plan. The sand creatures swam in the sand like dolphins in the ocean, and carried and pulled the boat at high speed. From the screams of the creatures, everyone realized that they were already close to the palace, but something was going wrong. A red moon appeared right above them in an instant. But Luca wasn't scared. Rather, he was overcome by a feeling of déjà vu. Moreover, he heard a voice in his head, familiar, but he did not understand whose it was. And then something came from the depths of the desert and threw the boat into the air. It turns out that this very heavenly palace is breaking out. Luca thought he had landed gracefully on the roof, but he accidentally caught his jacket on the roof's peak and got stuck. Our hero was amazed when the birthday cracker opened above him. It turned out to be Tempest, who immediately confessed his identity. Luca immediately clenched his teeth, realizing who appeared in front of him. Meanwhile, Tempest calmly studied his new acquaintance. Luca was sure that Tempest wouldn't notice from behind how Bridget launched her mallet at him. However, he noticed and dodged, accusing the girl of terrible upbringing and lack of hospitality. Bridget demanded that Tempest leave, but he refused, citing the fact that the results of his experiments had arrived. As rain suddenly began to fall in the desert after years of drought, Tempest declared that today was a day of remembrance. The demon knew about the rain in advance, but for the knights it was a complete surprise. The knights' cries didn't bother the demon mage. He was already in anticipation of the resurrection of the water demoness Bahil. The commander immediately tensed up, and the others were indignant at the demon mage's idea. And at that very moment, everyone noticed a girl's figure emerging from the palace gates. Still a baby in appearance, the great demoness Bahil woke up from a centuries-long sleep. Tempest immediately went down to the lady to greet her. He immediately knelt before her, showing respect. Kissing the water demoness's hand, Tempest asked her to defeat the knights. But instead, the demoness smashed her soft toy into the demon's face. The knights found the demoness's behavior shocking, although none of them expected that she would suddenly be on their side. Bahil immediately made it clear that she couldn't stand being bossed around. Besides, the water demoness wasn't particularly happy that some weakling had torn her from the beautiful worlds of Morpheus. Everyone watched what was happening attentively, but Bridget hastened to bring everyone to their senses and be on guard. The demoness looked at the people, and they did not arouse any interest in her, not even a desire to go to them. But as soon as she noticed Luca, she immediately rushed to him at the top of the tower, where he was stuck. Just like last time, Tempest, the demoness looked into our hero's eyes, or rather, into what was hidden behind them. And finally, Bahil came to life. In Luke, she recognized a certain Acheron, whom she had not seen for a long time. Without a shadow of a doubt that she was talking to an old acquaintance, she began the conversation animatedly. Luca made it clear to the demoness that he didn't understand what she was talking about. And then it dawned on her that her familiar demon had been reborn as a human. The information that Luca was still a demon, albeit a reincarnated one, was shocking. Tempest was eavesdropping on the dialogue and immediately started laughing, as he hadn't expected such a denouement. However, Tempest admitted that he had made a mistake in the past, and he felt not just a contract, but the entire body of a god of another world. Luke, still not understanding what these demons were talking about, still managed to notice the attack and pull himself up to the top of the roof. Luca managed to fall from his pike, tearing his cloak, but he clearly did not want to see a demoness in his opponents. Bahil saw the meeting with Luke and the resurrection next to him as a sign. The demoness clearly wanted to fight her old acquaintances before, so she immediately rushed into attack. But realizing that the newcomer was still weak, Bridget rushed to save Luca. However, the demoness managed to attack and cut off the commander's hand, but Bridget didn't even sob. She just called Jack, and her deputy immediately summoned the fairy. In just a moment, the commander regained control of her hand with the hammer, which she used to quickly cut off the demoness's head. But to the commander's great disappointment, there wasn't even a cut left on the demoness. Kenneth immediately rushed to help, but not a single bullet of his even touched Bahil. All this only angered the demoness, who had not planned to play with the knights at all. Now the water demoness intended to play with the lives of the knights as well, but since she was too lazy to do everything herself, Bahil called upon her water bombs. And while the knights dodged and tried to kill the creatures, Tempest watched everything. The demon mage's assistant was eating cake, not really interested in what was going on, but she was glad that Tempest was happy. The demon magician admitted that he had dreamed of seeing the demon's body burn, so now he was overwhelmed with emotion. Luca continued to think about Bahil's words about reincarnation, not knowing how to accept the essence of himself that he did not know about. Tempest was about to head north when something shining appeared in the sky. A moment later, it was Arthur's sword, which sank into the ground. The demon magician immediately realized that something unpleasant for him would soon happen. As soon as Arthur appeared on the battlefield, she did not take her eyes off Tempest and addressed him. Following the commander of the order, her deputy, Kiaran, arrived, for whom Arthur had already prepared an order. The commander of the order demanded that 3 minutes be bought for her. Even though the deputy understood that he couldn't defeat Tempest, he still clarified who Arthur was talking about. Kiaran was supposed to hold off the demoness while Arthur dealt with the demon mage, after which she hastened to check with the stranger observer whether he was a famous magician. It turns out that Arthur wanted to resolve the issue peacefully, and asked the demon to reconsider his evil plans. But it was not so easy to convince Tempest, and he refused Arthur. After which he grabbed his little one at supersonic speed and hurried to escape. But Arthur was not going to give in to him and immediately hurried after the target. Like two falling comets, the demon and the head of the knights cut through the sky. Siren hurried towards Luca and the others, demanding that they hold out for 3 minutes. Kiaran examined the demoness, looking for weaknesses and considering a strategy. First, the issue of flying water clots needed to be resolved. Kiaran tried to cut them, but this only scattered them into drops and wounded his comrades. Jack immediately cast a general regeneration spell, saving his friends from infection. Jack promised that he would look after his comrades, and they should fight. But Bridget didn't need to wait for the deputy's signal. She was already swinging her hammer at full speed. Luca was carried away by what was happening around him, but again with his sixth sense, he sensed an attack from behind and managed to defend himself. However, the heat of his flame was not enough, and the water passed through it. Luckily, Kenneth was nearby and managed to cover his comrade. It turns out the guy felt like he owed Luke, who had recently spent a lot of energy on another demon. Kiaran apparently understood that he was weak even for a demoness, so he gave it his all. The deputy summoned huge pillars of lightning to hold back the water demoness. The commander of the 6th detachment did not yield to him in mood, and froze everything in her path. The demoness disappeared into a ball of water, where, apparently, she felt more comfortable as a fish. Bakil kept an eye on the people who were covering her target and became angry at them, calling them bugs. Finally deciding to get it all over with, Bakil summoned her water demons. Since everything around the demoness was water, it was difficult to understand what was happening. However, Kiaran and others who were keenly aware of the flow of magic realized that the demoness was absorbing the water and growing in power. This process led Luke to what Bakil had said earlier, that his spirit smelled like water. Among all the knights, Bakil made eye contact with Luca and immediately became cheerful. However, our hero understood that her joy for people was equal to the desire to kill. Suddenly the world around Luca froze. Something in his head was ringing so loudly that it was unbearable. Everyone was worried about their friend. Kenneth was the first to rush to him. The voice in his head was driving Luca crazy, but the boy quickly realized that this wasn't the only problem. There, inside him, beyond the boundaries of his essence, there was a stranger, whom he had not even suspected all this time. The team of knights was a little confused, not knowing how to cover Luke, who, apparently, was not able to defend himself. Kenneth was the first to rush to keep the bullets out of his reach, and therefore immediately attracted the demoness's attention. However, with just one slap, innocent enough for her size, she knocked the wind out of him. She immediately rushed to attack the demoness Bridget, hoping to cut off her head this time. Both last time and this time, the blow only broke the shackles, but the demoness herself didn't even receive a scratch. On the contrary, a light stream of water from Behill threw back the commander of the 6th detachment, but she landed confidently and, brushing aside Jack's worries, was already thinking about a new attack. Luke still couldn't cope with the guests he had discovered in his body, which meant he couldn't control the flames. And it was this moment that Bakhil used to attack her old friend. In just a moment, a hole made by the demoness was visible in Luca's chest. Jack rushed to help, and interrupting the general regeneration, sent the fairy Neva to save Luca. The demoness clearly didn't expect that people had such power, so she was offended that Luca was saved. While the demoness was speaking about how Acheron had become weaker, someone responded to her words from the depths of Luke. It demanded that the body be given to him, that Luke obey and not interfere. At this time, the game of catch-up between Tempest and Arthur continued. Arthur assured that she was not going to back down because he was interfering with her subordinates. To prove her words, Arthur even managed to cut off the demon's legs from a distance. Tempest was struck by how cold-blooded Arthur was, as if she was cutting off not living flesh, but a toy. Moreover, the magician guessed that regardless of his answer, Arthur intended to destroy him. Arthur confirmed his guess, arguing that she was in a hurry to see her friends. Then Tempest tried to emphasize the choice of the head of the order between him and helping his comrades. But Arthur preferred not to choose, but to lie on 2 chairs, so she called down a hail of swords. Morrigan's rain fell upon the mage and cut him into pieces, separating his head from his body. But this didn't kill the demon. On the contrary, Tempest found it funny to lose his entire body. Besides, the only thing that mattered to Tempest now was that he had bought time for the demoness, after which he immediately disappeared. Arthur hurried to her comrades, but froze as she approached, seeing her comrades fallen, and only the figure of the demon towered over the bodies of those whom she was rushing to protect. Exactly 2 minutes before, the team of knights, exhausted but still alive, was thinking about attacking. Jack had it no easier than the others. His comrades' wounds were deep, and magic couldn't cope with everything. Kieran, Bridget, and Kenneth decided to launch a joint attack by combining magic. This is how these knights created Carlo Collodi's attack, which consisted of a stray bullet, leading the power of ice and lightning to the target. The knights hadn't counted on the ice, but they expected the demoness to be struck by lightning, but that didn't happen. In an instant, the demoness disappeared from their sight and appeared behind the shooter. Wanting to end it all, the demoness spared no effort in her attack. Then Bakhil walked towards the princess, keeping her right fist charged. The demoness moved so quickly that Bridget only had time to think that she would not escape. And at that moment, Jack had already saved her. Jack intercepted the demoness's hand as it pierced him through, giving the commander time to attack. This attempt irritated Bakhil for the 3rd time. This time she didn't even try to defend herself. The demoness continued to hold the weapon in her hands, just as she had caught it from Bridget, and used a wave of water to attack. Luke still hadn't regained control of his body and strength, so even seeing his friends dying, he couldn't do anything. And the voice inside him used the situation to its advantage and began to insist that he give up the body. But Luca overcame himself and rushed at the water demoness. Luca summoned a flaming blade and attacked with it, but Behil effortlessly blocked it. Moreover, the sword began to evaporate, as if the flame had been extinguished with water. Behil attacked Luca again and held her blade to his eye, claiming she was bored. Behil, like a spoiled child, began to act up, saying she was bored and summoned her water blade. But at the moment when the blade was about to fall on our hero, Kiaran covered him. Chirin ordered Luca to survive, as they all had orders to wait for the leader. However, Kiaran could no longer carry out the order. Behil cut down the deputy. The last comrade on the field fell defending Luca, and this became the last point of his patience. Luca didn't understand how, but he found himself back in his inner world. However, Luca did not immediately understand what this place was, because it was empty. Although there was still someone there, the owner of that voice in his head. And this demon offered his power to the guy without reserve, but in return asked for Luca's body. While Luke was examining Acheron, he explained that they were one and the same. But Luca refused to accept this. Moreover, he had no time for it, because everyone was waiting for him in the real world. Acheron was beginning to lose patience with his stupid, clueless shell, but he still decided to be more tolerant and explained that they were in the spiritual world. No matter how much they talk here, not a second will pass in the real world. Acheron decided to start all over again and introduced himself, saying that he had been sealed in the north. In other words, Acheron is a demon, and no matter how much Luke denies it, the boy is connected to him. But even this introductory information was not enough for Luca to understand anything. Acheron was angry, but still decided to tell how 15 years ago he managed to find a crack in the barrier. Acheron released part of his soul and went in search of a container. Nearby there was a village destroyed by monsters and a pregnant woman on the verge of death. Then Acheron entered her belly and was transferred to the body of Luke, who was then born. All this time, the demon endured Luca's pitiful and weak body, as well as his denial that he was a monster. It seemed so funny to Acheron, because Luke was a monster even before he was born. But Acheron was able to awaken in this body only thanks to that artifact. The demon wanted to achieve what he wanted by any means necessary, so he decided to set the guy's soul on fire. At that very second, Luca collapsed in pain, only having enough strength to scream. Luke's body was literally melting, his skin peeling off in strips, but Acheron continued to insist. Finally, Acheron deigned to stand up and walk over to the guy to grab him by the head. Luke writhed in pain, but Acheron was stronger and only mocked the boy's suffering. Furthermore, Luke's problem was that he had nothing to offer Acheron for the deal. Acheron offered the boy to give him his body, planning to burn Luke's soul. Acheron was already imagining how he would take over Luke's body and kill the arrogant Behil. The demon explained to Luca that the guy only needed to surrender, and then the flame would subside, otherwise he would burn for eternity. But unlike Acheron, who was afraid of eternal peace, Luke was not afraid of hellish pain. Gritting his teeth, Luca endured the heat and pain, not wanting to give up his life to some demon. Moreover, the guy even managed to get to his feet, albeit unsteadily. Hatred of demons and the unwillingness to let another one into the world of people gave Luca strength. Then Acheron decided to show the full power of his strength and his hellish fire. But Luca had something to surprise the demon with. The boy, overcoming the pain, took a step towards the enemy. Luke's body was losing its resemblance to a human more and more, but he refused to release the demon into the human world. Luca accepted a simple truth for himself. He could not suffer anymore, but he did not want to see others suffer anymore. Luke wanted to become stronger, and all this time he relied on the demon's power. And since this was the case, he decided to fight for this power. Luke was already weak in hand-to-hand combat, and under the current circumstances, he seemed to be waving his arms around playfully. Although Luke was telling the demon that he was in no emotion, Acheron knew that he was in so much pain that he wanted to die. Therefore, I didn't understand how the guy not only moved, but also tried to attack. Acheron, lost in the act of watching, missed a blow from the maddened Luke, although the demon still didn't feel any pain. Acheron did not answer. On the contrary, he tried to convince the guy that without payment by force, it would not be possible to control. But the problem wasn't that. The problem was that Luke considered the power the demon provided to be insufficient. The power that Acheron lent to Luke was not enough for him, and he wanted it all. And our hero was clearly ready to fight for her, not yielding even to the devil. Acheron couldn't believe that the boy was so brazenly and impudently demanding something that he wasn't even entitled to. Luke was clearly having a hard time, but he didn't even allow himself to drop to his knees. But Acheron liked it. He liked such a stubborn and strong-willed vessel. Bakhil walked slowly towards Luca, who seemed to be dozing, and did not even suspect that a war was going on inside him. Bakhil didn't want Acheron or Luke to die, she just wanted to have fun. Bahil summoned the water scythe. She was disgusted that her brother had descended to the people. However, when Bakhil tried to lower the scythe onto the boy, Luca intercepted her. The water demoness clearly didn't expect that the boy would be able to intercept her weapon, much less restrain it. But the most astonishing thing was yet to come, when the water scythe literally evaporated in his hands. At first, Bakhil thought that Acheron had finally arrived, but Luke did not let her be mistaken. Luke remained human, but his body and strength were from a demon. And this is exactly what Bakhil was waiting for. She finally became interested. Anticipating fun, the demoness rushed at Luca, and that was just what he was waiting for. In his new form, it was no problem for the guy to grab her fist. After which, with his free hand, Luca delivered a powerful blow to her solar plexus. Bakhil needed time to recover, so she jumped back into the distance. Bahil decided to use her magic to her advantage by attacking the boy from a distance. By defending himself from the water, Luca only increased the heat of his flame. After all, unlike Bahil, Luca remembered the basics of physics, according to which a strong flame evaporates water. Finally, the demoness realized that she was now in the role of a mouse, and not the other way around, and she became frightened. While Luca played cat and mouse with the demoness, the surviving Kieran watched everything. The deputy felt enormous strength coming from the guy, as well as his gaze, in which a demon was clearly visible. What was even more amazing was that, unlike the commanders, Luke managed to cut off the demon's hand. Now Luca felt revenge, because the one whom Bakhil considered a bug towered over her. But the demoness was not going to give up without a fight, and again rushed into the sky. The demon that drowned cities was once again gathering water for a decisive blow. Bakhil collected a huge cube of water that could easily flood her own palace. But even this did not frighten Luke, because now all the power of Acheron was in his power, and he was going to literally evaporate the water demon Bahil. And his intentions were so great that the guy extended his flame to the demoness. The cube, which had not even been sent to Luca yet, began to evaporate. Luke, who had just received his power, already used it boldly. But Bakhil, apparently, had lost her fighting ability over 100 years of sleep, since she didn't manage to escape the attack. In a couple of minutes, the problem of a dangerous demon and even a palace was solved. The fight was over and Arthur came down to Luca, not expecting to see the guy in tears. Our hero, full of regret, immediately rushed to the head of the order, asking her for forgiveness. The guy sincerely considered himself a weakling and blamed himself for not protecting the others. Arthur was initially frightened by this behavior, but was glad about it, because it was what helped the guy maintain his humanity. The head of the order hastened to calm the guy and assure him that everything was fine. Luca is not bad, because he fought side by side with his comrades, and most importantly, for them. In the end, he achieved a result that no one had ever achieved before, and defeated the demon. Therefore, Arthur, raising her hand to the sky, announced that Luca would become the sword that would repel invaders from another world. Now it's worth going back in time 15 years ago, when Kieran protected baby Luca. Of the entire order, he was the only one who protested against his murder. Arthur was already the head of the order at that time and clarified the details before making a decision. And the more details came to light, the more arguments there were to kill the baby. But even so, Kieran refused, offering to take full responsibility upon himself. The knight remembered that he could not start a family, so he offered shelter. But if it turns out that the child is dangerous, Kieran promised to kill him personally. And now, 15 years later, this grown-up baby has returned the favor to his savior. Kieran survived and even had part of his body restored, but Luca was still worried about his condition. The deputy looked at Luca, and the scene of his fight stood before his eyes. However, now in front of Kieran was clearly the simple-minded and stupid Luca he knew. For the first time, someone placed a hand on Luca's head, but not with the intention of offending him, but to pat him and thank him for his work. The rest of the knights were also fine, thanks to Jack's timely magic. Kieran was not lucky enough to rest. Arthur ordered Luke to bring the mentor. Arthur waited for the knights, holding her sword loaded, but did not even pay attention to those who entered. When the head noticed the guests, she immediately dispelled the spell, but Luca had already noticed her sacred weapon. Then Arthur told about her sword Khalidfulch, which her brother left her. After which the head pointed to a chair for Luca and asked him to sit down. And then she came from behind and pierced the guy's heart with a sword. But there was no blood. The boys were shocked by what had happened, not understanding what Arthur was doing. And instead of explaining, Arthur gave the order to the sword to open its eye. After which Luca again found himself in his inner world, still empty. But to his surprise, Kieran and Arthur appeared in his world, and she transported them here with the help of a sword. Arthur explained that she needed to meet the demon inside him. To her surprise, the demon was chained, Luke did not subdue him, but took control of him. Acheron was furious because the boy never made the deal, but he dared to return. But Arthur didn't care about his words. She quickly introduced herself to the demon. But Acheron didn't care about the name. He recognized the one who belonged to the family that had sealed him. The demon was so aggressive that Luca immediately rushed to yell at him and order him not to harm his friends. Acheron began to threaten to roast the guy again, but Arthur immediately laughed at this. The one who makes the sacrifice must be in these chains, not Acheron. And if so, then the demon cannot control Luke. Hurt at being found out, Acheron tried to defend himself, justifying himself by saying that he was weak now. Arthur already knew this, but decided to clarify that the problem was in the separation of the soul and body of the demon. Luca couldn't believe the leader's theory, nor that she had learned so much. But Acheron was not at all surprised that the heiress of the old family had hit the nail on the head. The demon assured that he would become 100 times stronger when he regained his body. To this, Arthur calmly noted that in that case, the demon's body would be a problem for them. Arthur reminded the others and explained to Acheron that the demon mage was interested in his body. Only now did Luke understand Tempest's words, which he had dropped before running away. Now Arthur understood Tempest's plan, and was glad that there were several demons, and they had time. Acheron listened to the knight's thoughts, and he was extremely unhappy that someone could use his body. The demon was furious that some human would use his body after he had tolerated another human. But he forgot that Luca wasn't afraid of him, and the boy perceived his screams as the hysteria of a teenager. Arthur quietly watched as the youngest in the order argued with literally one of the Demon King's parts, and she would have continued watching the show, but she decided to continue negotiations. Neither the knights nor the demon want Acheron's body to end up with Tempest, so she offered to cooperate. Arthur extended her hand to the chained demon to make a pact. The demon agreed, but in return he wanted to set his own condition. Acheron demanded that Luke train so much that his human body would no longer be a burden to him. Arthur more than liked this condition. Rather, she even supported the demon. The only one who was against it was Luca, and that was only because he didn't like the demon's orders. To show their interdependence, Acheron poured some of his power into the boy, and then the boy assured the demon that he would become stronger, but not on Acheron's orders, but out of a desire to protect his friends. Once an understanding was reached, Acheron broke his chains, revealing that he was in chains by his own choice. And then Acheron grabbed the boy by the throat, and burning each other in his flames, he made a deal. Kiaran watched everything that was happening carefully. He was not indifferent to the boy. Arthur noticed this, and Kiaran didn't even try to hide it. On the contrary, he would have found it suspicious if he hadn't been worried. The north was Siren's territory, so Arthur gave him orders to protect the demon. The demon himself asked Luke to attack the magician in the temple in the north. Afterwards, our heroes returned to the real world and told everyone else about everything at a general meeting. Arthur concluded the meeting by saying that the three of them were heading north. Bridget offered to help, but Arthur decided it would be unnecessary. In addition, to avoid attracting attention, they will travel north by land. Kenneth was quick to put forward his candidacy for the trip north. However, Siren refused. Kenneth needed Fran at headquarters. Luke immediately rushed to joke with Kenneth that the guy was worried about them. But Kenneth was no longer a young man to be embarrassed. On the contrary, he confessed honestly. Now it was necessary to decide how to fulfill Acheron's condition. The journey to the north will take time, so it is necessary to set out early. There was no time to waste, so Arthur suggested training on the road. Acheron had been eavesdropping all this time, so he hastened to express his consent. Arthur knew that Acheron would agree, but she was also concerned about Luke's opinion. But Luke didn't care how either. The main thing was to quickly become stronger in order to protect his family and control Acheron. Kenneth knew how hard Luke worked, so he was worried that he might overdo it. Arthur began giving orders for vigilance in the southern and eastern temples, and also notifying each department. Kiaran decided to check whether the demon mage was really aiming north. Arthur wasn't entirely sure, but she was more worried that the storm ruler mage was acting behind the scenes. He had been considered missing for a long time, so now it was important to understand why he had reappeared. Why did the demon mage come out of the shadows and appear before the knights now? However, Arthur had another crazy idea that stunned everyone. The head of the order thought that the magician who appeared before them was not the one who had summoned the king. But you have to be careful because he can hide anywhere. And now Tempest was hiding in his home village, restoring his body. His little girlfriend was also there and looked after him. At the same time, not forgetting to remind him that he is already old and does not have the same regeneration. Suddenly, they were visited by not particularly smiling guests in the form of the magician Ethan and the sorceress Ava. Ethan was angry, scolding Tempest for his selfish behavior. But Tempest preferred to remain friendly and greeted the guests. But the guests were not in the mood for politeness. Ethan immediately flew up to Tempest and slapped him on the back of the sofa. And then part of the sofa began to evaporate, molecules disappearing one after another. Tempest wasn't angry, but he was upset that his favorite sofa was ruined. However, Ethan continued to scold Tempest for his haste, which resulted in the death of the Demon of the West. Tempest, on the contrary, was sure that he should have come even earlier. The sorceress Ava decided to intervene in the useless squabble between two guys. She was worried that Tempest's actions might harm Lou, but Tempest refused, assuring that he had saved a piece of Bahil. Behind him on the table sat a preserved Bakil eye. This calmed Ethan. Now he saw that the demon's resurrection had justified itself. Besides, Tempest wanted to tell Ethan an amazing thing that he himself had recently learned. To begin with, the Demon of the North was reborn, and his body was in the North. This was shocking information for the visiting magicians. Tempest has long been looking for a way to awaken the demon, because, unlike the others, Acheron fell asleep recently. So Ethan offered to personally bring the new demon body. The magician was sure that they had to do everything to summon the gods of another world. In this case, the sorceress Ava decided to go south. After all, to summon the gods, all the demons are needed, including the demon of the south. Ethan decided to choose the direction of the east, and told Tempest to quickly recover and go north. After which, the arriving magicians immediately set off on their journey. These magicians longed for the resurrection of the gods in order to initiate the process of destruction and creation. The knights also set out on their journey north at this time. Despite the difference in their goals, both Arthur and Tempest were thinking about ending this war as quickly as possible. The squad had been running for several hours towards the temple in the north, but was still far from their goal. Moreover, for the first time, Luke saw a place that looked like a demon reserve, a forest where huge demons lived and no one hunted them. Kiaran told the boy that the temple was right behind the forest, but even he and the commander had to be careful. This whole forest is densely populated with creatures. Even the weak ones will tear them apart in a crowd. This assessment of the area from Siren scared our hero a little. Moreover, the rational Kiran suggested going around the forest, but the head of the order decided that their detachment would go in a straight line and jumped off the cliff into the forest. Arthur intended not only to reach the temple, but also to clear the area along the way. Kiaran had no choice but to follow the commander. The squad landed in a dark forest, and immediately the boys were surrounded by the sounds of local residents. The compressed air closed around the squad, and Luca immediately felt as if he had returned to that cave. But Arthur seemed not to feel anything. Without a shred of fear or doubt, she rushed on. As if she had gone mad, she cut down demons left and right, driven by madness. Luca watched the leader and was amazed at how quickly she managed to deal with the demons. It seemed as if she had not moved. Suddenly Arthur stopped, feeling that something was wrong around her. Arthur began to listen to the area and was pleased to discover a strong demon. She immediately threw her sword forward, killing the huge demon on the first try. While Kiaran and Luca were catching up with the leader, she was already listening to the demons ahead. Kiaran immediately realized that the chief had killed the master of the forest, and now they were safe. Luca was barely breathing after the run, and Arthur was already suggesting that they continue on their way. By nightfall, the detachment decided to set up camp and have dinner. While Kiran and Luca warmed themselves by the fire and fried fish, Arthur seemed to stand guard. When the fish was ready, Luke called the chief, offering to eat, but Arthur refused, explaining that she didn't need it and that she was fine. Luke couldn't understand how it was possible to be on the road all day, fight so much, and not even get tired. Since Kiaran confirmed it, Luke started eating while looking at the chapter. Now he remembered that Arthur was often in the dining room with everyone, but he never watched her eat. And at this time, Arthur reminded the boy of the need to start training. Luca assured that he would get to it, but first he would eat. However, Arthur did not want to waste time and hurried to impale the boy on the sword. While Luca couldn't move into himself, Arthur decided to help him with her abilities. She decided to conduct her first training in the spiritual world. When Luke moved, he couldn't believe how quickly everything was happening. Arthur, full of enthusiasm, immediately announced the start of training. Moreover, our young lady boldly approached Acheron with a request, as if he were an old friend. The head of the order wanted Acheron to transform the space around him into the place where he came from. The demon liked this idea, and with just one click of his finger, the entire team found itself in hell. Luke looked closely at his demon's world. Arthur explained that the boy and the demon needed to find harmony and start thinking alike. As always, Luca didn't understand what they were saying to him, and perhaps Kiaran didn't either, but he didn't give himself away. The deputy told the boy that each demon has its own special ability. Acheron is the Lord of Fire, so his vessel needs to understand how fire is structured and works. Luca still didn't understand much, but the idea of getting burned didn't appeal to him. Acheron was already impatient to wave his fists and train his vessel. Acheron was in no hurry to get up and engage in hand-to-hand combat, apparently wanting to harden the guy's body first. With just one snap of the demon's fingers, the lava underground began to shake and flames erupted. But it was not just fire. Tongues of flame were aimed at Luke. Luca managed to dodge and jump back, but he took up a position on the edge of the cliff. Then Arthur decided to remind the guy why he was training now. The young lady advised to use all one's strength,